Hey guys and gals, good to be back with you all today. Today we're going to be talking about something that you have heard me make reference to multiple times, and it is something that you, like the studio system, probably something that you never knew existed in this country until you hear about it today. And I'm talking about something called the production code. Now, you have heard me mention the production code in reference to The Public Enemy, in reference to Frankenstein, in reference to King Kong. And I'm sure you're like, what is he talking about? What are these censorship, taking things out of the movies? What's Harned talking about? Well, today you're going to find out. Let's go ahead and get started by talking about what the code was and exactly how it came to be. The Motion Picture Production Code was the set of industry censorship guidelines which governed the production of the vast majority of United States motion pictures released by major studios from 1930 to 1968. It was originally known as the Hays Code after its creator, Will Hays. The Motion Picture Producers and Distributors Association, which later became the Motion Picture Association of America, adopted the code in 1930, actually began enforcing it around July of 1934, and abandoned it in 1968 in favor of the subsequent MPAA rating system, which looks a lot like the one we have today. The production code spelled out what was acceptable and what was unacceptable content for motion pictures produced for a public audience in the United States. The office enforcing it was originally known as the Breen Office, named after its first administrator, Joseph Breen, who was not a good person. So, when we talk about the code today, we're going to be talking about a set of industry censorship guidelines. And what we have here is the code's seal of approval. You see there it says, this picture was approved by the Production Code Administration of the Motion Pictures Producers and Distributors of America. I want you to imagine for me, if you were an artist and you were painting a picture. I want you to imagine painting that picture, and then when you submit it for evaluation or for a grade or what have you, whoever is in charge of looking at the product, looking at what you've created, telling you, here's what you did wrong, here's where you weren't inventive enough, or here's where we're going to have to remove this. We're going to have to cover this up. This looks vulgar or inappropriate, or we're going to have to change your work. Okay? This is what happens to motion pictures in the United States of America starting around mid-1934. There is actually going to be a board of censors, and we're going to talk about who these people were, that could literally tell you what kind of movies you could make, what could be in the movies, could tell you to change your movies or a particular scene or scenes in a movie, take scenes out. So what you're about to hear is probably something you have never heard of before and never knew existed. But I promise you, after today, you'll be looking for the seal that you see there in older movies that you watch from this point forward. So here's the production code seal, and we're going to be talking about the code today. In the early 1920s, there were three major scandals that rocked Hollywood. The manslaughter trials of comedy star Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, who was charged with being responsible for the death of actress Virginia Rappe at a wild party in San Francisco during Labor Day weekend in 1921. The murder of director William Desmond Taylor in February of 1922, and the revelations regarding his sexuality, which seemed to scare everybody to death, and the drug-related death of popular actor Wallace Reed in January of 1923. Other allegedly drug-related deaths of stars Olive Thomas, Barbara Lamar, Gene Agles, and Alma Rubin resulted in persistent calls for censorship and the, quote, cleaning up of Hollywood all through the 1920s. These stories were, of course, sensationalized in the yellow press. Publishers like William Randolph Hearst, who, of course, was famous for yellow journalism, or the sensationalizing of stories in order to sell more newspapers. And, of course, these things were nice, juicy headlines that ran across the country. They appeared to confirm a widespread perception that many Americans already had of Hollywood, that it was Sin City. Now, this guy right here, Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, was one of the greatest silent film stars in all of movie history. But his murder charge involving a wild party, by the way, for which he was found not guilty, led to a public outcry for censorship in Hollywood. Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle was probably the biggest scandal. And he was accused of murder. And even though he was found not guilty by a court of law, and the judge who was in charge of his case actually wrote the guy a letter of apology, his life was completely ruined. His wife divorced him, and he was banned from ever working in movies again. So it was this guy right here, who had taken Charlie Chaplin under his wing, by the way, who prior to Charlie Chaplin was the most famous silent comedian in all of Hollywood. But his life was ruined by this party and the subsequent trial, which was really scandalous and helped again to create this belief that, oh, we've got to censor Hollywood. They're just wild people out there and just out of control, and we've got to censor them. Public outcry over perceived immorality in Hollywood and the movies, as well as the growing number of city and state censorship boards, led to the creation in 1922 of the Motion Pictures Producers and Distributors Association, which became the MPAA in 1945, an industry trade and lobby organization headed by a guy named Will Hayes, a well-connected Republican lawyer who had previously been the United States Postmaster General and who managed President Warren G. Harding's presidential campaign in 1920. Hayes immediately banned Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle from the movies and instituted a morality clause to apply to anyone that worked in the movies. He also derailed attempts to institute federal censorship over the movies. Now, this is Will Hayes. Believe it or not, as like I say, he worked for and managed President Warren Harding's campaign. He was Hollywood's envoy to Washington, D.C. Very well connected, a politician. He was sort of Hollywood's politics guy. It's actually going to be Will Hayes who derails attempts of the federal government to censor Hollywood. But what you're going to hear is that the studios are going to listen to his regulations. He's going to tell them, here's what you're going to have to do to clean up. Here's what you're going to have to do. Here are the set of rules and guidelines you're going to have to follow if you want to avoid federal censorship. So where I'm going with this is ultimately that Hollywood is going to end up censoring itself to avoid federal censorship, which would have been much worse. And this guy is the go-between between Hollywood and the politicians in Washington, D.C. In 1927, the fellow you just saw, Will Hayes, compiled a list of subjects culled from his experience with the various U.S. censorship boards, which he felt Hollywood studios would be wise to avoid. He called this list the Formula, but it became known as the Don'ts and Be Carefuls of list around town. In 1930, Hayes created the Studio Relations Committee, or the SRC, to implement his censorship code. But initially, the SRC lacked any real enforcement capability, especially during the Great Depression. The advent of talking pictures in 1927 led to a perceived need for further enforcement. Martin Quigley, the publisher of a Chicago-based motion picture trade newspaper, began lobbying for a more extensive code that not only listed material that was inappropriate for the movies, but also contained a moral system that the movies could help promote, specifically a system based on Roman Catholic theology. He recruited Father Daniel Lord, a Jesuit priest and instructor at the Catholic St. Louis University, to write such a code, and on March the 31st, 1930, the Board of Directors of the Motion Pictures Producers and Distributors Association adopted it formally. The original version became popularly known as the Hays Code, but both it and its subsequent revisions are now generally referred to as the Production Code. So now, in addition to cleaning up themselves, so both versions of what I just mentioned were known as the Production Code. However, Depression-era economics and changing social mores resulted in the studios producing racier fare that the code at that point, lacking an aggressive enforcement body, was unable to redress. This was known as pre-code Hollywood. So from 1930 to about mid-1934 is known as pre-code Hollywood. And The Public Enemy that we watched, Dracula that we watched, Frankenstein that we watched, King Kong, and Duck Soup are all part of the pre-code Hollywood era. In response to such movies as Warner Brothers' Babyface, starring Barbara Stanwyck, and Paramount Pictures' I'm No Angel, starring the great Mae West, Quigley and Joseph Breen, who was Will Hays' Los Angeles-based assistant, enlisted the Catholic Church to exert pressure on the Hollywood studios. They helped spearhead the creation of what became known as the Catholic Legion of Decency, as well as boycotts and blacklists of the movies throughout the country. So in addition to now apparently being responsible, Hollywood being responsible to promote a moral system, like as in Roman Catholic theology, the Catholic Legion of Decency is now going to organize boycotts and blacklists of movies that decent Americans should not go to see. So here are, in addition to the aforementioned scandals, including Fatty Arbuckle, here are the two of the most blatantly sexual stars of the pre-code Hollywood era, Barbara Stanwyck and Mae West. And you can tell just by looking at them that people who believe that Hollywood was offensive in Sin City, that these two would have targets on them. Everything about Mae West was very sensual. Many of the lines in her movies used a great deal of sexual innuendo and could be interpreted in any number of ways. And just the way she acted, the way she dressed, was very provocative and made more conservative Americans very uncomfortable. Here are some of the movies that would ultimately lead to a call to actively enforce the Production Code. Remember, 1930 to 1934, we're in the middle of the Great Depression. And Americans had more on their minds, and Washington had more on their minds than censoring Hollywood. They were trying to keep our democracy from collapsing. So from 1930 to 1934, you had some pretty racy movies that were made. Barbara Stanwyck, who you just saw as Babyface, was one of those, in which she literally sleeps her way to the top of a corporation. Red-Headed Woman was a film starring the great Jean Harlow, who we've talked a great deal about, who uses sex to manipulate men. And then finally, Norma Shearer, who was the wife of Irving Thalberg, the great producer in The Divorcee. Her husband has an affair, and she has an affair to get even with him. And that was just unacceptable to many Americans who believe that, in addition to these three films, that Hollywood was just getting out of control. It was just wild and needed to be curtailed. An amendment to the code adopted in June of 1934 established the PCA, or Production Code Administration, that actively began enforcing the code, requiring all movies released on or after July the 1st, 1934 to obtain a certificate of approval before being released. The first film to receive the MPPDA seal of approval, like the seals you saw at the beginning of the lecture, was The World Moves On. For more than 30 years following, virtually all movies produced in the United States had to adhere to the code. The production code was not created or enforced by federal, state, or city government. In fact, it was the Hollywood studios themselves who adopted the code in large part of hoping to avoid government censorship, preferring self-regulation to government regulation. So folks, they're doing it to themselves. This is Hollywood censoring themselves. The PCA was created by Hollywood to censor themselves so the feds would not censor them. In 1934, Joseph Breen was appointed head of the new Production Code Administration, or the head of the PCA. Under Breen's leadership, which lasted until his retirement in 1954, enforcement of the code became rigid and notorious. Breen's power to completely change scripts and scenes angered many writers, directors, and Hollywood moguls. The PCA had two offices, one in Hollywood and the other in New York City. So imagine that you're trying, if you're RKO, to re-release King Kong, and this Breen guy tells you, now, we're going to have to take this scene out, this scene out, this scene out. So this wasn't just new movies. This was movies that had been made like Frankenstein, we talked about, like The Public Enemy, like King Kong, where they would go back, watch the films, and say, you're going to have to take these things out before this movie's going to be acceptable. There's a reason why a lot of people haven't heard about a lot of these pre-code Hollywood films is because they were so censored that many of the studios didn't bother to re-release them. The first major instance of censorship under the PCA, the production code, involved the 1934 film Tarzan and His Mate, in which brief nude scenes involving a body double for actress Maureen O'Sullivan had to be edited out of the master negative of the film. So, the code. This was given to all the producers, directors, and studio heads in Hollywood, telling them what they could and could not do. Imagine Michelangelo being handed this whenever he was getting ready to carve David out of a piece of marble. It's like, well, you're not going to be able to do a nude today, Mr. Michelangelo. You're going to have to change that, have him wear boxers or something. This is the closest thing that we've ever had to a minister of propaganda. And while Will Hayes was in Washington, D.C. with the other grafters and corrupt politicians, his crony, Joseph Breen, who was racist and homophobic, was heading this production code and literally became a minister of propaganda. This was the most powerful person in Hollywood. The film that drove the censors crazy, Tarzan and His Mate, as I mentioned, was the very first film to get really hammered by the production code when it was released in 1934. There is a scene when Maureen O'Sullivan, who you see here pictured with Johnny Weissmuller, who was sort of Michael Phelps before Michael Phelps, winning 5 gold medals in the Olympics in swimming. There was a scene where Jane, Maureen O'Sullivan, gets thrown off of a tree into a pool of water, and as she's falling, her dress gets caught on a tree limb and torn off. And for a few moments, she was swimming around nude on camera. And that is where the production code went, oh no, we're not going to release this to theaters. So Tarzan and His Mate was the first film to be censored by Hollywood. This is an example. Here you see pre-code. See Tarzan and His Mate. See Jane, the way she's dressed there? Well, look at how she's dressed on the right by the time the code was being rigidly enforced in 1939. It looks like she's wearing a potato sack. Tarzan Finds a Son that was made in 1939. Notice how her hair is long, how you can barely see any skin at all. This is what I'm talking about, folks. Even cartoons were censored. The production code enumerated 3 general principles as follows, and there were all kinds of miniature guidelines that fell under each of these general principles. First, no picture shall be produced that will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience should never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. Correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. Specific restrictions were spelled out as particular applications of these principles. Now, I want you to listen to these, and I want you to imagine that you're a director. And how do you work around it? This is just a few of them. Nakedness and suggestive dances would be prohibited. Okay, those are out. The ridicule of religion was forbidden, and ministers were not to be represented as comic characters or villains. The depiction of illegal drug use was forbidden, as well as the use of liquor when not required by the plot or for proper characterization. So you can't show anybody drinking on camera. Methods of crime were not to be explicitly presented. So if you're a bank robber in a movie, you can't actually show the bank robber trying to crack the safe or blow it up or something. You had to have their lookout say, "Hey, Fred, how's that coming in there with the safe?" or something like that. References to alleged sexual perversion, like homosexuality, and venereal diseases, or STDs, were forbidden, as were depictions of childbirth. So you couldn't have homosexual characters. You couldn't show a woman who was pregnant, so there couldn't be any pregnant bellies at all on camera. Beds had to be, even married couple beds. This is why in a lot of old movies you'll see two beds and wonder why the husband and wife are sleeping in different beds. That's the code, folks. That's the code. They could not. The language section banned various words and phrases that were considered to be offensive. So no cursing at all. Even the word damn apparently scared everybody to death, as you're going to hear when we get to Gone with the Wind. Murder scenes had to be filmed in a way that would discourage imitations in real life, and brutal killings could not be shown in detail. Revenge in modern times was not to be justified, so you couldn't have like the Punisher who went to go take revenge, or Taken, like Liam Neeson. You can't have people taking revenge on folks. The sanctity of marriage and the home also had to be upheld. Pictures shall not imply that low forms of sexual relationship are accepted or common thing. Adultery and illicit sex, although recognized as sometimes necessary to a plot, could not be explicit or justified, and were not supposed to be presented as an attractive option. Now listen to this one. Portrayals of miscegenation were forbidden, which meant mixing of the races. Miscegenation means mixing of the races. So you could not have interracial couples. So the code was also racist. Scenes of passion were not to be introduced when not essential to the plot. Excessive and lustful kissing was to be avoided, along with any other treatment that might stimulate the lower and baser element. The flag of the United States was to be treated respectfully, and the people and history of other nations presented fairly. The treatment of vulgarity, defined as low, disgusting and unpleasant, though not necessarily evil subjects, must be subject to the dictates of good taste. Capital punishment, third-degree methods, cruelty to children and animals, prostitution, and surgical operations were to be handled with similar sensitivity. So there you have it, folks. And I now entreat you to watch the short video, that the link to which has been posted on my Canvas page. So if you're not sufficiently horrified yet, just wait till we start, we hear what's going on in this video, and we talk about some other things later in the semester that had to be censored. Have a great day, everybody. Remember to turn in your notes.